Hi, welcome to part 2 of the GUI buttons tutorial. It's also a tutorial on creating a class in processing. So if you're just here to find out how to make a class, go ahead and grab the GUI buttons tutorial part 1, the code from there, and hopefully that'll work. Or you can go through the tutorials. So let's just say this is part 2 and underscore that it's a class. Okay, so I'm going to introduce you, as to the best of my ability, to a concept of class, which is sort of one of the primary concepts in what is called object-oriented programming. This here in the processing.org website, this objects tutorial is excellent by Daniel Schiffman. So I would recommend going through that if your goal is to learn how to write classes and understand how they work within processing and other object-oriented languages. And I'm going to apply it very specifically because it comes up in this project. It's time that we made a class, and that these buttons, I think, or these button banks, these banks of buttons, would do really well or behave a lot, behave better. It would be easier to manage if we put it all into a class. Okay, so we'll go ahead and do that. And again, if it would be worth going through this just to understand what a class is. I'm not necessarily going to explain everything about what a class is. But in the context of the button tutorial, what we really have right now is a bank of buttons. And it's great because we can do multiples of buttons. But what if we wanted like a matrix of buttons, or what we want a row of buttons to control samples, another row of buttons to control effects, or various buttons to do different things. We can do that, but we're going to have to copy an awful lot of code, all this code here, over and over again, and then give variables new names like initial x2, initial y2. There would be a lot of things to do to multiply it. What if you want 10 different banks of buttons? Well, you'd have to sort of copy and paste all this text 10 different times and keep track of all the different variables. It gets a little bit messy. So instead, what I'd like to do is create a class. So I'm going to create a new tab here, and I'm going to call it capital C for class underscore, and I'm going to call the name of my class push me for buttons. Okay. And then I'm going to start a new class in this new tab. I'm just going to go class and call it push me. And I guess the general nomenclature in classes is they tend to start with capital letters. So we'll go ahead and do that. And then my class will have that scope, and then down here somewhere it'll end. And I'll say end. Class, push me. Okay, so one of the things we can do, which is very, very nice, is we can more or less take all the concepts here and just copy them over almost whole hog into this class. And then I'll show you how to use them within the context of the larger sketch. Okay, so class is really sort of like, it's like a little miniature machine, the way I like to describe it. It's like a little machine that creates these objects. So when you create a class, you're creating a template, or you're building this machine that then can create all these objects. All right, it's not the object itself, it's just a machine that creates these objects. All right, so if you create the class push me, or the push me machine, then I can create as many rows of buttons as I would like to, just by using this machine without replacing this code. And you kind of have to designate the different things in the machine that you'd like to control. So if you want where the button's located, or the size, or the mountain buttons in there, you need to be able to tell that class or that machine a certain number of parameters. Okay, and so let's just continue on, and hopefully, conceptually, everything will fall into place once we kind of get things in place. If you're a little lost now, just hang in there, and hopefully it will come together. So one of the first things we need to do is create this thing called a constructor. Okay, so I'll just make a label called constructor. All right, and the constructor basically is going to create an instance of this class. So for if we think of this as a machine, we're going to have this little bit of code that says, give me the instructions through this thing called a constructor, so that I can make one instance or one of these objects. So if you want to make, let's pretend it's not a GUI of buttons. Let's pretend these are little houses or something like that, little model houses. All right, like within it's a machine to build little model houses, but within the constructor we can say, okay, build me one more little house, and we can tell it like what color it's going to be, what kind of basic shape, how many rooms, that kind of thing. And so it's the constructor that builds one instance, or tells us the parameters for cranking out one of these things. Okay, and it takes the name of the class, so push me. Okay, and then it takes a number of arguments there, which we'll fill in, and then it's going to have a scope within the class. Okay. And not only can you think of this constructor as this thing to create an instance of your class, but also it really parallels a lot to the setup function within our main sketch. All right. And then there's a number of variables that we pass into the constructor that are going to be necessary for our main sketch. But again, just bear with me. I'm probably not explaining this the best, but bear with me, and we'll get through this. Okay. So I'm going to create a little heading here. I'm going to call them constructor variables. And if you've been following along in the SuperCollider tutorials, these things are a lot like what the SuperCollider calls arguments. Right? These are the arguments that you want to pass in from the outside. So certain things within this class are just going to be used within the class, and that would be a lot like the variables in SuperCollider. So we're just going to use, something internally within the class. But the constructor variables, or these arguments, are really passed from the outside, and they're the things like, if we're building model houses, like the color and the shape and size that might vary from instance to instance, right? So even though this machine makes houses, you can create a bunch of different houses with slightly different parameters, and all the internal machinery that, like, wood and floor plans and stuff like that might be the same from house to house. It's just contained internally within the class. Okay, so let's look at all our variables from our button grid, or our row of buttons, or our bank of buttons, and let's find out what things we really need to change that will be variable from bank to bank. Okay, so I'd say the number of buttons in that bank definitely will change from instance to instance. Its initial X and Y location, that would change. These things, however, are calculated based on some other information that we give it, so those won't be in there. So since we're going on, let's grab these number of buttons, the initial X and the initial Y. Let's copy those, and let's pop those into these constructor variables. Okay, and then we'll format those better later. And the button width and button height will change from instance to instance. The gaps might change, and here's where we can have some decisions. I'll just introduce you to this concept, but we're not going to worry about this right now. Each class can have multiple constructors, so you can create, you could give different constructors, meaning that some might have a little bit more things that you modify. So, for example, right now, I'm going to create a constructor that doesn't really take into account the gaps. I'm just going to keep those fixed. The gap, the PI gap, or the gap that it grows when it's moused over, and the gap between the buttons. I'm just going to keep those things fixed within the class, so I'm not going to make those variables. But you can create a second constructor that says, okay, well, I'm going to really want to change those gaps. And you can have another one that says, okay, if I give you these sets of data, this set of data, then it will also modify the gap within it. Okay, but we won't worry about that now. So button width and button height, we said, we're not going to grab the gaps. All right, and let's see what else. The trigs, no, these are things we have to initialize. The icon paths, I think we're gonna do a pass for the icons and the icon paths for now, because it's slightly trickier. And the keys and the labels for now, and I'll introduce those later, because we're going to have to do a couple extra steps. And whether it's horizontal or vertical, I think that might be a constructor variable. Right? Okay. So I think these are probably important things to have. So what these constructor variables, what that means is that we'll have these variables here. They'll actually be set by the constructor when we actually create an instance, okay? And then they'll be available to the whole class. So we're just going to declare them here, and then we're going to initialize them down here after in the construction part, which is a lot like setup. All right, which is kind of how we do. So if we just make just a comma delineated list here of all the various ones, we can say number but xi, yi, button width, button height, and the either horizontal or vertical. You can keep all those in there, all right, and just get rid of all those. Okay. So this is a bit of it seems a bit of a redundant process. This next thing I'm going to show you, but basically what you do is within the constructor, from the outside, when you create an instance of this class, you pass in all these variables, and then you pass those variables in here to these variables. Okay, and I'll try to show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to create a bunch of arguments that get passed in from the outside or passed in upon instance creation when I try to create one of these. So I'm going to have an int, and I'm going to just put the letter A in front of all of them, like as an argument. So I'm going to have an A numbut. Okay, and I'm going to have another int, and it'll be a xi, and then another int, and it'll be a yi, and then another int, and then it'll be a bw, and then another int, abw, and then another int, abh, and then another int, hv. Okay. I don't know why it doesn't like this. Oh, it's just saying we haven't used them. Okay. So then that's going to be the nature of our constructor. We're going to, and you'll see later again, we're going to call that and then pass in all these variables to create our instance. And then we have to now pass these constructor variables into the class variables, into these ones that can be used within them. So we're going to do, just very simply say num but equals a num but. Okay, and then xi equals, and that's why it's helpful for them to have different names. AXI, and yi equals AYI, and BW equals ABW, and BH equals ABH, and HV equals AHV. There you are. We didn't put an A in front of our HV. Okay. So there you go. So now we've created a constructor that takes a number of arguments and then passes them in so they can be used within the class. Okay. And just really a few new concepts, but a lot of copying and pasting we were doing. So that's essentially it. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take most of what's in setup here and put that into that constructor, because a constructor acts a lot like setup. It takes in the initial data that we need to make that particular instance. So if we're making model houses, color, size, etc., and then it calculates how much paint do we need, how much wood will we need, that sort of thing. Okay, so we're going to take all these things that we do. We're not going to do the OSC and things that belong sort of to the sketch, the fonts and such. Though we could initialize fonts, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to keep a font for all the, overall sketch. But we will take all this stuff, the icons. We're going to calculate LRTB, HV, whether it's horizontal or vertical. We're going to calculate the triggers and the mouse overs. We're going to calculate all that stuff within the constructor, okay, after we've passed in all the variables there. So I'm going to paste all that in there. Okay. And of course, we're going to need to grab all these variables then. So let me line everything up. A bunch of red text will come up because we don't have, or do we? No, we don't have. Oh, they're over here. Okay. So then we're going to go ahead and grab all the stuff that we didn't grab before. Maybe the easiest thing is to just grab all of it, all the way down here, all the variables, and then put them here. We're going to call them class variables. So in a sense, these are a lot like the vars, or the variables in SuperCollider. They're really just going to be used within the class, but not passed in from the outside. I'm going to paste all that in there and then just delete, do a bunch of deleting. Let me straighten all that up. Okay, so the number of buttons we already passed in, and the xi and the y, the initial x and I. These things need to be calculated, so we'll keep those. Get rid of button width, button height. The P gap and the gap will, like I said, hard code this. We'll keep those in there as a class variable, but we won't have it accessed from the outside. Okay, and then the button triggers and the mouse overs, so we're going to keep those there. The images, icons, we can keep all this stuff, but we're going to deal with that later. It's sort of a later step, probably a later video as well. The font, like I said, we'll just do that on the sketch level. So we'll get rid of this. And then this HV we're passing in as from the constructor, so we won't worry about that either. Okay. So these are our class variables that then now can be calculated here internally. Here. Right. So let's just comment out all the icon stuff for now. And the triggers, the mouse over stuff, horizontal verticals, LRTB is good. So that's mostly it. That's everything we need to do. Okay, so we just copied over all that text over from setup and put it within our constructor. So there's the beginning of the constructor and there's the end of the constructor. Okay. Now, the nice thing about classes is you can have methods within the class or functions, something that runs certain things, and they can be separate parts of your class. So we're going to create a function here, or method. Let me just make some extra lines here. All right, and you do the same way you do on the main part of the sketch. We're going to call it void, and we're going to call it DRW for the draw. So we're going to create a method that will do all the drawing functions for our class. And we're going to have that. You can have arguments, but in this case we won't. And then open and close. And basically then we can copy everything from draw that we had in our previous thing, or just about everything. We don't need the background. That's a sketch-based thing. But we'll copy everything from background all the way down to the end of draw. We'll copy that, and we'll pop that into here. Okay, and then Alt-T to straighten everything out. So now everything is going to be in the separate method called draw. Right? We have our constructor built, and then we have this other method called draw that's still within this class. Okay, and then we're going to create a different method for each of these things: the mouse pressed, mouse released, mouse moved, and key pressed, key released. All right, to use within our class. So it's going to be a separate method that gets called for each of those different things too. So let's create a bunch of them, and I'll copy and paste and then update them. So void ms, we'll just call it msprs. Okay. Okay, and then with the no arguments, empty arguments, and then like that. And then I'm just going to copy that there, mouse pressed. Actually, I'll get rid of this line too because I'm just pasting from. Okay, and then I'll copy that. And I'll paste. I'm going to have mouse released, paste again, key pressed, key released, I believe, and there's a mouse moved in there too. So we'll just update all these. We're going to have a mouse release. We'll call it MSREL. We're going to have a mouse moved, MVD maybe for mouse moved. We're going to have a key press, so KEY there, and a key released, so go KEYREL. Okay, and these are class methods within the class that then get passed out. And again, I'll show you how to do that in a bit once we get everything settled. So just trust me for now. So let's grab the code from each of these areas and pop those in. So we'll start up here with mouse pressed and grab everything that's in mouse pressed, copy it, and paste it into mouse pressed. Okay, and same with this, everything that's in mouse released, copy it, paste into this method within and then everything within mouse moved, copy it, and then we're going to copy everything within key pressed, and then everything within key released. Okay, straighten everything up. All right, so we have all our methods in there, I think, pretty much, that deal with everything. And you know, it's a bit of an art, and I don't know if you call it an art, but it's a bit of a skill learning what things to put into separate methods and stuff like that. But you'll get the hang of it once we deal with the classes. I wanted to introduce this concept, but I'm not really doing sort of a full instruction on how to write a class and how that can be quite involved. All right. So, but as far as our button thing is concerned, this is going to be very, very helpful to have things within a class. And I think that's more or less it. We just have to kind of comment all our image things because um, we're not prepared to deal with images, and it'll probably throw an error. So that's just in the draw. So we got rid of the image stuff. Okay. All right. All right. So let's save that there. I mean, I suppose if you're following along, you can maybe save this as a part 1 and then maybe a part 2, just because now we're going to start deleting some things. You might want to keep things in their place for now. Now, I'm going to go here and just get rid of all the stuff that I don't need that I copied over into a class. Then I'm going to show you how to instantiate the class and put the methods where they belong. All right. So I think this was for a later tutorial, but we'll get rid of that serial. We're going to get rid of all these things that have nothing to do with that were copied back into the class. And I'm going to keep the font, get rid of that. Keep the OSC stuff, keep the font creation stuff. Get rid of all this stuff that I copied over. Okay, so my setup now looks like this. It's just the size, the OSC stuff, and the font stuff. And I'm going to get rid of all this stuff in Draw that I copied over. Okay, so it's just a background. I'm going to get rid of all the mouse press stuff, all the mouse release stuff, all the mouse move stuff, and all the key press stuff, and all the key release stuff. Okay, I am going to keep this be on function because I'm going to use this in here. I'm using it already in there. But that's fine because since it's declared here on the root of the sketch, it's accessible by all the classes as well. So we can use that function within the class. It's no problem. All right. So we have our thing. And if we run it, it should run. Nothing happens, of course. And I'm going to show you how to make things happen. All right. So now that we have our class, we have everything that needs to do to draw a bank of buttons within this. We have to create an instance. And so like I said, this class pushMe really is just a template. It doesn't make anything necessarily, or it isn't an object itself. It's just a machine to make objects, okay? And it gives you a bunch of information that helps you make an object, and it requires some input, and that's this constructor. It says, tell me how many buttons you're going to want, tell me where to put it, tell me the width and height of each button, tell me whether it's a vertical line or a horizontal line of buttons, and then I'll draw you a row of buttons, okay? So I'm just going to copy this over, because we'll need this information, over to here. And what you do is, I'll keep it on my clipboard. So first, what we're going to do is we're going to declare the class as a variable, or an instance of the class as like we do a variable. So the data type is your object or your class name. We're going to make a pushMe. And you've encountered this with these things, OSCP5s and such. So OSCP5 is an object within that library. It's a class, and you're making one instance of it called OSC. It's the very same thing with your own class. You're making an instance of the pushMe class, or the pushMe library, or whatever you want to call it. So we're going to make a pushMe, we'll say buttons. TT. So we'll make one instance of the pushMe class, and we're going to call that instance buttons. All right? And we're just declaring it here, just like we did these other things. And then in setup, we're going to, just like we did these other things, we're going to instantiate it. Or we're going to say now buttons equals a new instance of the class pushMe. Okay, and then we have to fill it with all these arguments. Now that's where our clipboard comes in handy, because we need to know exactly which arguments and what data types they are. And they have to correspond exactly. If we don't put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 integers in the argument thing, it'll balk and say, no, I can't make that because I don't know what that is. It doesn't exist. Okay? So we need a number of buttons. Let's make 7 buttons, for example. And then the next int is the initial x. Let's put the initial x at, say, 50. And then initial y, let's do 50 again. And then the width of each button, well, say maybe make that 100. And then the height of each button, let's say maybe make that 40. And then whether the button is horizontal, plane, 0 for that, or it's a vertical thing of buttons, and a 1 for that. So let's make it a vertical thing of buttons. Okay. And then all right. So that's it declared, and that's it initialized. So now basically at this stage right here, this line right here creates an instance of pushMe. So now we have a row of buttons. It goes through all these things. It comes in through this constructor. It passes those to the constructor variables. So it sets those. It runs all these calculations. It calculates LRTB. It figures out if it's horizontal or vertical. It, creates a set of triggers, a set of mouse over indicators. So it does all that when we do that. Okay, when we run that. And this is being run in setup. So when we declare it, run that in setup. By the end of setup, by the time it gets to this line, we've created a row of buttons there and pushMe. Okay, so if we run it, still nothing happens. All right. Why is that? Well, that's because even though it does exist, in fact, what happens is we have to put our methods in their respective places. Okay, so all this drawing behavior can happen, but we have to call that method draw from that class. Okay, so if we go into draw, and this is how we do that. If we go into draw, we say we're going to take the buttons, which after this line here exists. It is a thing. It is an actual object. We're going to take the buttons and we're going to run that method draw, DRW. And then we need those two parentheses. Okay? So it's going to run the function draw within draw. So as this goes through, it's going to, every frame, it's going to run through everything in the draw. It's going to run through all the things in this method, because we called it there. So draw will draw the background, and it will call this method draw on this class buttons, or this instance of the class buttons, and it will perform all that code there. Okay. So in a large sense, a class or an object is just an abstraction. I mean, we're still doing the same code. We're just doing one level abstracted. Okay. But that can be helpful if we want to create several of them based on the same thing, and you'll see how that works. Okay, and so then the logic would go that we'd have to run all of these functions or these methods within our class in each of the places they belong. So we're going to, every time we press the mouse, we want it to run all the code here in mouse pressed. So we're going to say buttons dot msprs. Okay, and again, on down the line. So msrel. And then msmvd, and then we're going to do buttons key press, and then buttons key released. Okay, and so if we do that, we should now have a fully functioning row of buttons. There we go. And it has our mouse over behavior, and it still has our press behavior. Okay, and there you go. And well, why do we go through all that trouble? Well, for a number of reasons, which are very, very useful. We can create fairly quickly another row of buttons by not having to do that. So let's make two of these, buttons and buttons 2, and we'll just copy this line here, and we'll call it buttons 2, and we'll change the parameter slightly. We'll offset the, let's see, this is 7 buttons. Let's make a few more. Let's make 10 buttons here, and we'll offset the thing so it doesn't conflict with the first button. So instead of 50, that goes to say 150. Say we'll start at 200 x, something like that, and we'll put it down a little bit so you can see. We'll make it like 80 or something like that. And then we'll make these not so wide, maybe 40 and 40. And then we'll make them horizontal buttons. Okay. And then, of course, we need to add the methods for this instance as buttons 2. So just a little bit of copying and pasting. And we're just going to change that to buttons 2 draw. Buttons 2 mouse pressed, buttons 2 mouse released, buttons 2 mouse moved, buttons 2 key pressed, buttons 2 key released. So we run that. Now we have 2 banks of buttons. Okay, we have these ones here and these ones here. Okay, great. Well, I'm going to end that tutorial there. We've covered a lot, making a class and what a class is and how to make one and how to replicate it. And I think that's somewhat helpful. Again, please do, if you want to learn more about classes, do this tutorial and maybe look up some other things as well about classes. As far as we're concerned, we've made a pretty flexible and nice way of doing a bunch of buttons, doing a fairly sophisticated GUI. You can create several instances of your button class and make different rows of buttons, different grids and such, and create a pretty good GUI. So in our next video, I will start covering a few of the dressings that we left out. So how to maybe change the labels involved, or maybe how to have different colors and such like that. So we're going to sort of enhance our class. All right. Well, good luck with that.